Hey everybody, let's review this endocrine lab activity. And let's start by identifying the hypothalamus. Now, first of all, this is a mid-sagittal cut of the brain, right down the longitudinal fissure, and then this is a medial view. So where are we going to find the hypothalamus on this figure? This region right there is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is actually part of the brain. It's part of the central nervous system. And it's part of a larger part of the brain called the diencephalon, which also includes the thalamus and the region right in back of it, the epithalamus. So the hypothalamus, thalamus, and epithalamus make up what we call the diencephalon region of the brain. So what does the hypothalamus do? Well, the hypothalamus exerts major control over the endocrine system, and it does this by acting on the pituitary gland. And this entire structure below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, and there's two different regions of it. You have this region in the front, which is called the anterior pituitary, and then you have the region in back of it, which is called the posterior pituitary. And we'll talk about the anatomical and the physiological relationship between the hypothalamus and both of these regions of the pituitary gland on the next slide. And lastly, we have the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is located in the epithalamus region of the brain. And that's the pineal gland right there. So what's this endocrine gland going to do? Well, the pineal gland produces the hormone melatonin, and it does this in response to darkness. And by doing so, it's helping our body establish our circadian rhythms, our 24-hour rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles. Maybe you take melatonin supplements at night to help you sleep, to stimulate that sleep cycle. Now let's take a closer look at the structural and functional relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus has a different relationship with the anterior pituitary than it does with the posterior pituitary. And let's go ahead and start by looking at the relationship with the anterior pituitary. And in this figure, this is the anterior pituitary. And ultimately what the anterior pituitary is going to do is release hormones into the blood, which are going to act on downstream endocrine organs. For instance, the anterior pituitary is going to release TSH, which is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. It's going to release ACTH, which is going to stimulate the adrenal gland. It's going to release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, which are going to act on the ovaries and the testes. But the release of these hormones from the anterior pituitary is going to be under the control of the hypothalamus. Where's the hypothalamus on this figure? This region here is all the hypothalamus. And if we take a closer look at the hypothalamus, what do we find up here? What are those structures we're looking at there? Those are nerve cells. And so what's going to happen is that nerve cells, neurons in the hypothalamus are themselves going to release hormones that are going to travel down to the anterior pituitary, and these hormones released by the hypothalamus are going to control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So for instance, these nerve cells up there, these neurons, might release the hormone TRH. TRH is going to travel down to the anterior pituitary, and it's going to stimulate the release of TSH. Or these neurons in the hypothalamus may release the hormone CRH. CRH is going to travel down to the anterior pituitary and cause the release of ACTH. Or, to finish this off, these neurons might release GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which travels down to the anterior pituitary and causes the release of FSH and LH. So what is it about the hypothalamus that qualifies it to have so much control over some of these major endocrine axes? Well, the hypothalamus is part of the nervous system. It's in the brain. It's part of the central nervous system. And because of that, the hypothalamus is constantly receiving sensory information from all over the body. And so based on that sensory information, the hypothalamus can integrate it and then activate appropriate endocrine axes to respond to that. So for instance, it can activate the thyroid axis by releasing TRH. It can activate the adrenal axis by releasing CRH, or it can activate the gonadal axes by releasing GnRH. And the last thing I want to talk about is the anatomical relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and specifically how hormones released from the hypothalamus make their way down to the anterior pituitary. And the answer to that is through the circulatory system, through blood vessels. And the circulatory system, or the blood vessel network that allows hormones to travel from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary, is called the hypophyseal portal system. And normally what happens in the circulatory system is that you have the arterial system that feeds into a capillary bed, and the capillary bed is where the exchange of materials occurs at, and then that capillary bed is drained by the venous system. But when you hear the term portal in the circulatory system, that means that there's two capillary beds in a row, and that's what's happening with the hypophyseal portal system. So what happens is these neurons release hormones into a capillary bed up here at the hypothalamus. Those hormones travel down these blood vessels, and then they enter another capillary bed. And it's in this second capillary bed where these hormones from the hypothalamus diffuse out of the capillaries, and they act on endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary and cause the release of hormones there. And I referred to these cells up here in the hypothalamus as neurons, but we can actually call those neuroendocrine cells. They're neuro because they're neurons, but they're endocrine because they're releasing their products into the blood. Normally, nerve cells release their products onto other nerve cells or onto effector organs, but when those nerve cells release those products into the blood to act on distant target cells, in this case in the anterior pituitary, we can call those neuroendocrine cells. Now let's take a look at the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And this relationship is a little more straightforward, and it involves what we call these neuroendocrine cells. So what happens is that up in the hypothalamus, we have these groups of cell bodies. So these are all cell bodies for these neuroendocrine cells. And those cell bodies are going to produce hormones. So the hormones are going to be made up there in the cell bodies, and then they're going to travel down the axon through the hypothalamus all the way down to the posterior pituitary. And it's in the posterior pituitary where the axon terminals are located. And so these hormones that are produced all the way up in the hypothalamus are going to be stored in synaptic vesicles that are located in the axon terminals. And they're just going to stay there until they're stimulated to be released. And once they're released, they travel from the posterior pituitary into the blood, into the systemic circulation. And so the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue. It's basically axons and axon terminals. And that's different from the anterior pituitary because the anterior pituitary are endocrine cells, and the posterior pituitary is mostly nervous tissue. It is nervous tissue. Now, when we have collections of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system, we call those nuclei. And there's a couple important groups of nuclei that we're going to find in the hypothalamus that are related to the posterior pituitary. This collection of cell bodies right there, this nuclei, is called the paraventricular nuclei. And the cell bodies of the paraventricular nuclei are going to produce the hormone oxytocin. And then that oxytocin travels down the axons and is stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. Another important group of nuclei in the hypothalamus are the supraoptic nuclei. And these are the supraoptic nuclei. And those cell bodies are going to produce the hormone antidiuretic hormone, which again travels down these axons and is stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. And so those are the two main hormones that the posterior pituitary is going to release: antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So what's going to stimulate the release of these hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, from the posterior pituitary? Well, to answer that, we have to go back up here to the cell bodies in the hypothalamus. And here are the cell bodies. And what do we have coming off the cell bodies? What are these little guys there? Those are dendrites. And dendrites are the receptive regions of these neuroendocrine cells. And so when these dendrites receive the appropriate sensory information, that's going to generate an action potential. And those action potentials are going to travel down the axons. And when they hit the axon terminals, they're going to stimulate the release of those hormones, in this case antidiuretic hormone, from those axon terminals into the blood. And so really the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary are directly linked by these neuroendocrine cells. So just to briefly recap on the anterior pituitary side of things, stimulation of neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus causes the release of hormones into the hypophyseal portal system, which make their way down to the anterior pituitary, which causes the anterior pituitary to release its own hormones into the blood. And then these hormones from the anterior pituitary act on downstream endocrine organs to stimulate the release of hormones there. And then on the posterior pituitary side of things, stimulation of neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus causes action potentials to travel down the axons to the posterior pituitary, and that causes the release of hormones from the posterior pituitary into the blood. All right, let's move on to the thyroid gland, and lo and behold, this is the thyroid gland. The figure that we're looking at here is an anterior view of the neck. So this structure right here is the trachea, and these are cartilaginous rings that wrap around the trachea, and you can palpate those. If you run your finger up and down your neck, you'll be able to feel those cartilaginous rings. And then above the trachea is that structure right there, and that's the larynx. And so the thyroid gland wraps around the anterior side of the trachea. And there is a right lobe, there is a left lobe, and there's an isthmus that connects the two. And the coloring of the thyroid gland is actually dark red, kind of this purplish color. And that's because the thyroid gland has a really rich blood supply to it. The body's constantly pumping out thyroid hormone, and so you need a good blood supply so it can be released into the blood and get into the systemic circulation. And then over here, we have the endocrine axis that the thyroid gland is part of. It's part of the hypothalamo, pituitary, thyroid axis. And as the name implies, it starts up in the hypothalamus. This is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus releases TRH into the hypophyseal portal system, and that TRH acts on the anterior pituitary. In response, the anterior pituitary produces and releases thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone goes into the systemic circulation, and it binds to receptors on the thyroid gland. And in response, the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone, but there's actually two different forms of thyroid hormone. The main form of thyroid hormone that the thyroid gland produces is T4, also called thyroxine, and it produces a small amount of T3, triiodothyronine. And T4 is the inactive form, T3 is the active form. So what happens is that most of the thyroid hormone produced is T4, and then when it goes to its target tissue and it goes inside the cell, that's when it gets converted to the active form, T3. So as with other variables, the body wants to maintain homeostasis over circulating levels of thyroid hormone. And there's an ideal set point, an ideal value that those thyroid hormone levels will be at. But as long as circulating thyroid hormone levels fall within a specific range around that set point, then that's okay. And what's going to happen is that thyroid hormone levels are going to oscillate around this set point all throughout the day. They're going to be low, then they're going to increase, they're going to reach a high point, then they're going to go back down. They're going to reach a low point, then they're going to go back up, they reach a high point, then they go back down. And so they oscillate around this set point all throughout the day. And the question is, what mechanisms are in place to allow this oscillation to happen? And the answer to that is negative feedback. So what happens here is as the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone into the blood, levels of circulating thyroid hormone go up. But then what happens is that when these levels reach this upper limit of the range, That's where negative feedback kicks in. And what happens at this point is that thyroid hormone acts back on both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and it depresses this thyroid axis. Specifically, what it does when it acts back on the hypothalamus is it decreases the release of TRH. When it acts back on the anterior pituitary, it decreases the release of TSH. And by doing so, you're decreasing stimulation of the thyroid gland. And so that causes circulating levels of thyroid hormone to go back down. But then eventually, you reach a low point. Circulating levels of thyroid hormone are reduced. And when they're low, that's when the negative feedback turns off, or it's more depressed. And what does that do? That allows levels of TRH and TSH to go back up, which causes increased stimulation of the thyroid gland, which causes levels of circulating levels of thyroid hormone to go back up until it reaches this upper range again. Then negative feedback kicks in again, and that causes circulating levels to go down. Then it reaches this lower point, and negative feedback goes away. And this is what happens all throughout the day, and it allows thyroid hormone levels to stay within this specific range that the body wants it to be in. Moving on, we have the adrenal glands. And we have two adrenal glands, one that's located on top of each of our kidneys. And there's really just two regions of the adrenal gland that I want you guys to know. One of those is the adrenal cortex. Now, cortex is just a generic term that means outer layer. It's like the bark layer on a tree. And so this outer layer of the adrenal gland represents the adrenal cortex. And the other area is the adrenal medulla. And medulla, again, is just a generic term, and medulla means middle. It's the middle portion. So the adrenal medulla represents this middle portion of the adrenal gland. And if we were to look at this magnified picture here of the adrenal gland, all of this area above is going to represent the adrenal cortex, and then all of this area below is going to represent the adrenal medulla. Now, the terms cortex and medulla, you're going to see other places in the body. For instance, the outer layer of the kidney is called the renal cortex. And then the middle layer of the kidney is called the renal medulla. Again, they're just generic terms to describe the outer layer of the organ and the inner layer of the organ. Where's another place in the body that you see the term cortex? What about up in the brain? The outer layer of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. Okay, that's where our thinking happens. That's where our conscious thinking happens. So the adrenal gland is an endocrine organ, but different regions of the gland are going to produce different hormones. And let's start down with the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla specifically are going to release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, really, these are epinephrine and norepinephrine are neurotransmitters. We find these in the nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine onto effector organs to stimulate the fight or flight response. But what's going to happen in this case is that epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be released into the blood. And because they're released into the blood and they're circulating around to act on target organs, they're considered a hormone. They're considered endocrine-like. Now, the adrenal medulla is going to be under the control of the nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic nervous system. So during the fight or flight response, sympathetic neurons are going to travel down to the adrenal medulla, and they're going to stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And then what's going to happen are these epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline, are going to act on different target organs to help facilitate the fight or flight response. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system mediates the fight or flight response during exercise, anxiety, fright, all that kind of stuff. And so epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to act on target organs and help mediate part of that response, dilate the bronchioles, vasoconstrict certain blood vessels, stuff to that effect. The adrenal cortex then releases a different set of hormones. And specifically, it's going to release aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens. Now, what do all these hormones have in common? What do aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens all have in common? They're all steroids. They're all steroid hormones. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each one. And we'll start with aldosterone. One of the times that aldosterone is released is when you have low blood pressure. When your blood pressure is too low, that stimulates the release of aldosterone. And what aldosterone is going to do, it's going to be released into the blood. It's going to act on the kidneys. And what it does is it increases the reabsorption of sodium into the blood. And wherever sodium goes, water goes with it. So aldosterone is ultimately increasing the amount of water that goes into the blood. And when you do that, when you increase the amount of water in the blood, you increase blood pressure. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the urinary system. Aldosterone is also released during long-term stress. So when stress turns into days, into weeks, perhaps months, and you get into the long-term stress response, aldosterone is going to be released, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to increase blood pressure. And that's not necessarily a good thing over a long-term period. Then we have cortisol. Cortisol is a metabolic hormone, and specifically, it's a type of steroid that we call a glucocorticoid. It's going to regulate blood sugar levels, and specifically, it's going to raise blood sugar levels. Now, the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex is under the control of an endocrine axis. Specifically, it's under the control of the hypothalamo pituitary adrenal axis. And so what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is going to release the hormone CRH. It's going to travel down to the anterior pituitary, which is going to release ACTH into the blood. ACTH is going to act on the adrenal cortex and cause the release of cortisol into the blood. And one of the times that cortisol is released, like aldosterone, is during long-term stress, the long-term stress response. And the goal of cortisol during this time is to increase blood sugar. But, at this point, during long-term stress, you've pretty much burnt through your glycogen reserves. So cortisol has to get a little bit creative, and it has to break down fats and proteins and make new glucose from those fats and proteins. And breaking down proteins to make glucose isn't necessarily a good thing. Cortisol is also an immune suppressant, so it suppresses the immune system. And so that's another reason why the long-term stress response isn't necessarily beneficial. One, you have aldosterone that's increasing your blood pressure. And then two, you have cortisol that's breaking down proteins to increase your blood sugar, and your immune system is also being depressed. And so the long-term stress response isn't necessarily a beneficial thing. Your body's trying to get you through this time, but it has to kind of go through some extreme or detrimental measures to do so. And this has pharmacological applications because there's a whole group of drugs called corticosteroids that basically mimic the actions of cortisol. And you can give these to a patient to suppress the immune response, to suppress inflammation. And so they're potent anti-inflammatory agents. Then we have androgens. And androgens are male sex steroids. And when you think of male sex steroids, you think of testosterone. And testosterone is by far the most potent male sex steroid. But the adrenal cortex is going to release other androgens that are less potent. And an example of that is DHEA, which stands for dehydroepiandrosterone. And this is an androgen, but it has weak androgenic activity. But what's going to happen is it's going to be released into the blood, and then other tissues in the body can convert that DHEA into the more potent testosterone. And from there, testosterone, if need be, can be converted to estrogen. And so what's happening is that these androgens that are released by the adrenal cortex are basically circulating around in the blood and serving as a precursor pool that tissues can use to convert to both testosterone and estrogen. Okay, what's going on here? Let's orient ourselves first of all. So what we're doing is we're looking at the back of the neck. This is a posterior view of the neck. And here we have the pharynx, or the throat, and these are muscles, these are skeletal muscles that are involved in the swallowing reflex. And the throat continues on as this muscular tube right there. And what is that muscular tube? That's the esophagus. So the esophagus is going to take that food down through the thoracic cavity into the stomach. What about the tube in front of the esophagus, anterior to the esophagus? What is that guy right there? You can see these cartilage rings that are wrapping around the front side of that tube. That's the trachea. That's the windpipe. And the trachea is anterior to the esophagus, and you can palpate those cartilaginous rings. What about this gland right there? It looks like a gland, right? Looks glandular, looks like it secretes things. Well, we've already talked about that guy. That's the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland wraps around the front of the trachea near the larynx, and it doesn't quite complete that loop around the posterior end. And then embedded in the thyroid gland. On the posterior side, the back of the thyroid gland, we have these 4 little nodules. And these nodules are part of the endocrine system. What are those? Those are the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands are going to be involved in maintaining homeostasis over calcium levels in the blood. So circulating levels of calcium are something that we want to maintain homeostasis over. We want a certain level of calcium at all times circulating around in the blood, and the parathyroid glands are going to be involved in that. And specifically, they're going to be involved in increasing blood calcium levels. So the parathyroid gland is going to respond to low blood calcium levels. And we call that hypocalcemia. So in response to low blood calcium levels, the parathyroid glands are going to produce parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is going to have a few different mechanisms that it's going to use to help get those blood calcium levels back up where they need to be. One thing that it's going to do is it's going to act on the kidneys. And what it does is it causes the kidneys to increase the amount of calcium that is reabsorbed into the blood. And so less calcium is leaving in the urine and more of it's going into the blood. Another thing it's going to do is it's going to act on the bones of the body. And the bones of the body have a pool of calcium and phosphorus that's there just for this reason, to help maintain blood calcium levels. And so it's going to help increase the amount of calcium. It's going to stimulate cells within these bones called osteoclasts. And these osteoclasts are going to break down this calcium pool that's made just for this reason and ship it out into the blood. And so it helps increase blood calcium through that mechanism by using that stored pool in the bones. And lastly, what it's going to do is it's going to increase the activation of vitamin D. And vitamin D is also important in blood calcium. It acts on the intestines and causes increased calcium reabsorption from the small intestine. And so those are the 3 different mechanisms that parathyroid hormone is going to use to help raise blood calcium levels. And by the way, what do we call that type of stimulus where there's a circulating level of nutrient or electrolyte in the blood that's stimulating the release of a hormone? We call that a humoral stimulus. So low blood calcium levels, low levels of calcium circulating around in the blood are going to be detected by these parathyroid glands, and we call that a humoral stimulus. And this is where I want to finish up with regards to the endocrine system. We're not going to cover all of the endocrine organs. For instance, the testes and the ovaries, we'll wait till we get to the reproductive system. But this is where I want to finish up because there's a couple important endocrine organs that are in this figure. So what about this organ? What's this big bad organ here? That's the liver. And the liver has a whole bunch of different functions. We talked about it in the digestive system. What does it do with regards to the digestive system? Well, it produces bile. The liver makes bile, and bile travels down the bile duct, is secreted into the duodenum, and it emulsifies fats. What else does the liver do? The liver is an important metabolic organ. It's important in maintaining blood glucose levels. It stores glycogen and breaks glycogen down into glucose and ships it out into the blood. What else does it do? Well, it's important in detoxification. It takes a lot of products and detoxifies them, breaks them down, and eliminates them from the body. And I'm trying to think of another one here. The liver also produces what we call plasma proteins, proteins that are released into the blood that do a whole host of things, help transport materials around the blood, help maintain osmolarity, stuff to that effect. And believe it or not, the liver is an endocrine organ. The liver is part of the hypothalamo, pituitary, hepatic axis. And the hypothalamus is going to secrete GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, which travels down the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary and causes the release of growth hormone. Growth hormone is released into the blood, acts on the liver, and in response, the liver produces the hormone insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor 1, primarily. And insulin-like growth factor is going to act on the cells of the body, and it's going to cause cell division. It's going to cause cell division, which is hyperplasia, and also cell growth, which is hypertrophy. And so we call this the growth axis. And ultimately, the growth axis is going to work through the liver through the production of insulin-like growth factors, and then insulin-like growth factors act on the cells of the body and cause cell division and also cell growth. And then what else do we have going on here with regards to the endocrine system? We have the pancreas. And again, we've already talked about the pancreas. We've talked about the pancreas in the context of the digestive system. And in the context of the digestive system, the pancreas produces pancreatic juice that has a whole bunch of digestive enzymes in it. That pancreatic juice is secreted into the pancreatic duct, which is eventually secreted into the duodenum, and that's where it digests all of the macronutrients, lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. And that is what we call the exocrine function of the pancreas. When a product is secreted into a duct, into an open body cavity, then that's called exocrine. And when it's secreted into the pancreatic duct, that technically is an open body cavity because it's connected to the duodenum, which is an open body cavity, part of the digestive tract. So the pancreas has an exocrine function, but it also has an endocrine function. And endocrine is when you secrete a product into a closed body cavity, into the interstitial fluid or into the blood. And the pancreas has a major endocrine role. So we can break this down by looking at histology of the pancreas. This is a histology slide of the pancreas. And all of these dark pink staining cells, all of those cells have a digestive function. Those cells are all going to produce pancreatic juice and secrete that into the pancreatic duct. So those are all exocrine cells. Those are all part of the digestive system. But scattered throughout these exocrine cells are islands of endocrine cells. These light pink staining cells are endocrine cells. And we call these islands of endocrine cells, we call those islets of Langerhans. So that represents the endocrine portion of the pancreas. So here's a drawing of one of these islets of Langerhans, also called a pancreatic islet. And there's 3 different types of endocrine cells there. We have beta cells, alpha cells, and delta cells. And what I want to point out is that scattered between these endocrine cells are capillaries. So these are the blood vessels, the capillaries that these endocrine cells are going to release their products into. Now there's 2 main types of cells that I want to talk about here. One of those are beta cells. These are all beta cells. And does anybody know what hormone these beta cells produce? They're going to produce insulin. Okay? And what about these alpha cells? What are these alpha cells going to produce? They're going to produce glucagon. And so the 2 main hormones that are produced by the pancreas are insulin and glucagon. And what are those hormones going to be involved in? What do insulin and glucagon do? What do they regulate? They regulate blood sugar. And specifically, insulin is going to be released during a period of hyperglycemia, during high blood sugar. And it's going to act on cells of the body to take up glucose and try to decrease that blood sugar. It's going to act on the liver, and it's going to tell the liver to take up glucose from the blood and store it as glycogen. Then we have glucagon. And glucagon does the opposite of insulin. So glucagon is released during periods of fasting, during periods of low blood sugar that we call hypoglycemia. So glucagon is going to be released into the blood. And what does glucagon do? Well, it acts on the liver, and it tells the liver to take that glycogen and break it down into glucose and ship that glucose out into the blood. And by doing so, it increases blood sugar. So the pancreas, from an endocrine function, is involved in regulating blood sugar levels. And insulin is going to be involved in lowering blood sugar, and glucagon is going to be involved in raising blood sugar.